I had a friend reach out to me, and to keep things anonymous, I'll refer to him as P. Brown. No, wait, that's no good. I'll call him Peter B. Yeah, that's better. So Peter B said that he's got a friend that pastors a church who needs a lectern or a pulpit or podium thingy, and he asked if I'd be willing to make one for him. Well, I've never made anything like that before, but I figured, why not? I headed to Fusion 360 and I designed this thing. I gave it a pretty stout base and then trimmed it out with some decorative molding to make it look fancy. Then inside the pedestal is an integrated shelf for a bottle of water or whatever, and then the top opens up so that he has a place to store all of his confetti cannons for when things start to feel a little Pentecostal. I'll do some more decorative molding at the top and then outfit it with some sort of cross on the front. This is going to be quite a challenge, but I got the faith that we can make it happen, so let's get into it. The first thing that I had to do is to go see my friend Craig at Walton Woodwork to pick out all the lumber that I'll be using for this. I wanted to find boards that didn't have any sapwood or other color variations, and I really just wanted a consistent dark brown walnut with pretty straight grain. Well, I found a bunch that would work well, and then I had him cut them down so that I could easily get them home in my truck. Then I lugged them downstairs and into the shop where I could start the milling process. Now, since the boards were pretty flat and didn't have any bows or twists, I could go right to the planer and get them down to their final thickness. Then I took each one over to the joiner to get one square edge. Now, some of the pieces of the design are wider than any of the boards that I bought, so with this in mind, I cut a few of the boards down to size so that I could glue up some panels. And once I have given them all ample time to dry, I could remove all the clamps. Next, I used the table saw to cut all the remaining pieces, but in an effort not to bore you with all that, here it is in 5 seconds. And as it turns out, the entire project was all about this piece. At this point, I put in a Roman ogee style bit into the router table, and I could give the top edge of the base pieces an accented edge. Now we're ready to start cutting miters. I tip the blade in the table saw down to 45 and I lock it in. Then with my miter gauge set to exactly 90 degrees from the blade, I could start to cut in the angled ends. I didn't need to measure for the first cut on each piece, but for the second, I had to be very precise and sneak up to my line. Then with them all cut, I could line them up and then tape the outside faces of the joints together. Then it gets flipped over and I can spread some glue into the joint. I also put on some more pieces of tape to help me remove squeeze out later. I added some glue to the edges of the panel, and then I could just fold the whole thing up and wrap it around the piece. And I put on some more tape to hold the last joint closed, and then I threw on some clamps. And once it had dried, I could pop off the clamps and then inspect how the joints turned out. One of them had a little gap to it, so I smushed some glue into it along the entire length of the joint, and then I just ran my sander over it. The dust from the sander got worked into the gap, and then it pretty much disappears completely. Next comes gluing together the pedestal of the lectern. It's pretty important that this remains perfectly square, so I had to improvise with some long clamps to pull it into square while it dried. Then on the inside, I could glue in the bottom as well as the integrated shelf, and then the other side can get put on and clamped down. Now when I attach the pedestal to the base, it'll be an end grain to a face grain joint, so I wanted to reinforce it. So I marked out exactly where it'll be mounted, and I drilled some holes through from the top. Then I flipped it over, and I countersunk each one of them from underneath. At this point, I could add some glue and put the pedestal on top of the base. And then I took a bunch of clamps, and I didn't clamp anything with them. But they were heavy, so I stacked all of them on top to hold it down real good. And once dry, I could extend the holes from below and add screws. Now let's dress it up a bit with some trim. When I had the pieces fitting nicely around the pedestal, I could give them a round over at the router table. Then I could add some glue, put them in place, and squeeze them all together with a band clamp to close up the corners. Then the pedestal top could go on. And then I could add some more trim pieces around the edge of that. I had to make a temporary shelf for the pieces to sit on with some scrap pieces, but this ended up working really well, and it held the trim at just the right height. When that dried, I could add another section of trim at that end to cover where the pedestal met the top. This hides that joint, and it increases the fanciness of the whole piece by at least another 5 points. And the last bit of trim to go on was the decorative cove molding at the very bottom. I used a variation of the traditional cove bit to make the pieces, and then I just repeated the same technique as I did for all the others. I measured and cut them all out at the table saw, sneaking up to my lines. I added glue, and then I used a band clamp to squeeze them all together. And this easily adds another 10 fancy points. Now at this point, the base and the pedestal are done. So now that means I can start to build the top of the lectern. I begin by first cutting in the mitered edges for the sides. Now each of these side pieces has an angle to it, and I tried to think of the easiest way to cut this so that it's identical on both pieces, and the simplest way that came to mind was just use the bandsaw. So I fastened both pieces together with tape, and then I cut the angle into them both at the same time while staying about 1/16 of an inch off of my line. I was just outside of it. Then with the majority cut off, I could leave the pieces fastened together and then use the belt sander to remove the rest of the material up to my line. Then the front piece of the top got its mitered edges cut in, and then all the pieces got a round over on their top edges. Now in the same way that I put the base together, I put the top together too. I taped the mitered joints together, I spread some glue, and then I wrapped it around the panel and I clamped it shut. Then I glued in some riser blocks into the front corners, and these will reinforce the front joints, but also it'll hold the hinged top up at the right height. And speaking of the hinge, I can now get busy cutting the inlay for that. I start by first tracing it with a razor. This creates a knife line of where it's supposed to go, and also makes a groove where the tip of my chisel can fit into when I'm chopping out the recess for it. I remove the bulk of the waste with my trim router and a straight bit. I just set the depth to whatever the thickness is of the hinge, and I cut away as much as I can without getting too close to my knife line. Then it's all chisel and mallet work from this point. So while you watch this section of the video, allow me to play you the song of my people. And with it all cleaned out, I can now test fit the hinge. The front edge of this piece gets an angle cut in so that the lid will be able to close completely. And then I can drill in all the mounting holes for it with a self-centering drill bit. Now, the pastor made a request for me to laser on a short inscription to be a reminder for him. I suggested, "Thou shalt check your fly," but we ended up going in a different direction. Now I could fasten on the lid. I had to go up and pick up some mounting screws for this hinge since it didn't come with any, and at the hardware store, there was only one kind of screw that would fit. And wouldn't you know, God decided to test my patience by making them all flathead screws. Now I could finally glue on the top section of the pedestal. To do this, I just ran a bead of glue on the edges, marked out exactly where it needed to go with some tape, gently set it down on top, and then made some small adjustments until I had it perfect. And then I just filled up the inside with a bunch of heavy clamps until it dried. And to give the whole piece even more fancy points, I decided to add on some trim pieces around each of the pedestal faces. I cut out a bunch of thin 1/4-inch thick strips and then I glued them onto the front edge. Then I continued this around to the other sides as well. Then once I had all the vertical pieces in place, I could add some horizontal pieces to connect them and to finish out the look. Then on the CNC, I cut out the outline of a cross design that the pastor liked. I used a 60-degree V-bit to give the edges a chamfered look, and then I had it cut down far enough so that I almost broke through at the bottom. After the job was complete, I could secure it face down and lightly sand the bottom to free the wooden outline of the cross. Then I could skim on a thin coat of glue onto the back side of it and center it onto the front of the podium. And since it would be kind of awkward to clamp, I just taped the snot out of it until it was dry. The last thing to go on was the little catch that would keep the pastor's Bible and notes from falling onto the floor. Then I did some final touch-up, sanded everything up to 220, and then I was ready for finish. And for that, I'm using the stung oil from Bumbleshoots again. You've seen me use this for a bunch of other projects now, and I keep coming back to it since it's so nice and easy to use. I mix in some solvent to thin it up a bit so that it penetrates the wood better, and then I simply brush it on. It's super easy to get full coverage too, since you can just sort of slop it on and brush it around. Then after a bit, I just wipe off any excess there is, and that's it. Over time, it hardens to offer good protection to the piece while really darkening up the wood and bringing out the natural beauty of the piece. If you'd like to try any of this for yourself, use the Fisher10 coupon code to save 10% off your purchases over at bumbleshoots.com. Well, here's the finished product. Man, it turned out so good. The black walnut looks amazing. The subtle cross detail on the front just turned out fantastic, and it really blends in well. And trimming out the borders of each of the sides was the right call. I love how that looks. The reason I was intimidated by this project was that I was worried I wouldn't be able to keep all the miter joints tight, but they all turned out real sharp, and they ended up looking great. And all the different layers of decorative molding on the top and the bottom, it really dresses it up, and it takes the entire piece to a new level. I think I've achieved a new fancy point high score. Overall, I'm thrilled with how it turned out, and I couldn't be happier. It's absolutely stunning, and I'm so excited to deliver it to the pastor and to get his reaction. So let's do it. Loading this thing into the truck sure brought back a lot of memories of when I used to be in the mafia. And once I had it all packed up and ready to go, I could drive over my own lawn like a maniac before setting off for my journey. Now, because I had a solid 6 hours of windshield time ahead of me, I needed something to keep me alert. So I fired up a favorite podcast of mine called Faith Talks Wood. Here, I'll let them introduce themselves.
Welcome to Faith Talks Wood podcast. I'm Will from Flat Woodworks.
And I'm Tom from Mountain Valley Maker.
And we're a podcast about, well, faith and woodworking, and we talk about a little bit of everything in between.
Anyway, I highly recommend it if you're into the whole podcast thing. There are a couple of great guys, and their topics are always interesting, and they often interview some great guests from the woodworking community. Well, it took me about 3 hours to get from the west side of the state to the east side, and then I finally arrived at the little church. I got to meet the pastor, and we chit-chatted a while before unloading the lectern and hauling it down the aisle to the front of the sanctuary. Once we got it situated where its new home will be, I started to unwrap it from the beehive of blankets that I wrapped it with. Then I let him remove the final one, and I got his reaction.
What do you think?
That's beautiful. That's great.
Isn't that nice?
I love it. I love it. Oh, that's so sharp. Wow.
Yeah, so I think
Yeah.
it's at a decent height.
Perfect, yeah, oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And then
Yeah.
I had to get this inscription just like you wanted. I thought that's an awesome reminder.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
and you can keep,
Yeah.
keep all your
Keep throat lozenges and extra notes and
squirt guns for when people fall asleep. Yeah.
just open up the good. Oh man, this is beautiful.
He absolutely loved it. He told me it was even better than he had hoped, and that sure made me happy. This was a super challenging build, but I am so thrilled with how it turned out and that I got to bless him and his church with this piece. Well, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz, and until next time, take care, and I'll see you later. I didn't bring any clamps over. Oh my gosh. Burger time. Oh, that's not gonna fit. Butts. Oh, shazbot. That's not good. Crap. Dang it. Dang it. Oh, of course you did it upside down. Of course you did, idiot. Oh, this is not a self-centering. I can't use this. Crap. Oh, crap. It's slipping and sliding. Okay. I gotta use salt. Otherwise this ain't gonna stay put. Ow! Ow! Oh no! All my holes for my hinges are off. Well, how the heck did that happen? Oh. That's how it happened. Doggone it. Oh well, that's not the end of the world.